see how I do. This represents an attempt to put together different topics that I think are not entirely original, but have not yet been discussed quite in the same framework. Anti-Semitism has historically tended to focus on the most prominent manifestation of Judaism in a given era. Thus, in the beginning, religion; in the modern era, race; and today, Jewish nationhood in the form of Zionism in Israel. As a result, the relation between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism has become increasingly contested. Anthropologists would tell us that these liminal areas, occupying a boundary between legitimate and illegitimate criticism, academic and popular discourse, and involving sometimes innocent and sometimes insidious anti-Semitic historical memes, are dangerous territory, but that's where this conference has decided to venture. Here's an illustration of the challenge. When I teach my students, for example, I show a cartoon from the Second Intifada showing Ariel Sharon holding a cup of blood, and I ask, is it anti-Semitic? Obviously, when war takes place and people are hurt, blood is shed, one is aroused, one wants to criticize or empathize, and you can say it's legitimate. But then I show them historical images. Simon of Trent being murdered by Jews for his blood. Der Stürmer with the ritual murder. In other words, there are certain topics that, viewed one way out of context, could be debatable or innocent. In a different one historical context, are seen as clearly anti-Semitic. And I think that's the model we need to use here in a lot of these cases. Ironically, I think the problem is a result of threefold progress. In the first place, today, no one admits to being an anti-Semite. In the past, that was not a problem. Number two, scientization of discourse. Even extremists of all stripes are now forced to argue on the grounds of science and scholarship, or at least pretend to do so. Anti-evolution people talk about creation science, intelligent design, to defend unscientific ideas. Holocaust deniers invoke evidence supposedly from physics and chemistry to deny the undeniable. Third, with increasing public sophistication comes skepticism toward received wisdom and standard narratives, the negative side being a corollary willingness to grant credence to flawed or even preposterous ideas in the name of open-mindedness. In our case, for example, the standard narrative is that, number one, the Jews were a people indigenous to the ancient Near East. Number two, the Jewish national movement was morally as well as substantively comparable to any other. And three, reestablishment of a Jewish commonwealth was therefore an act of restoration rather than usurpation. Its only unfortunate distinction being that it occurred in living memory when people could see the injustices or unpleasant side effects, as opposed to having taken place in the midst of antiquity. The negation of these three postulates increasingly takes the form of calls for the end of the state. That a view only recently confined to the fringes is now entering mainstream discourse should be disturbing. It commands the attention of the historian. After all, the 20th century witnessed many difficult transitions, changes of borders, moves in populations, the Greek-Turkish settlements, the expulsion of the ethnic Germans, the partition of India. Only in this case do we move beyond pondering the ethicality or necessity of this suffering to talk about reversal. I think that's compelling. Something's going on here. Richard Rubinstein has talked about the Jews as the witness people, why the West is obsessed with what Jews do. There's a sense that somehow what happens to the Jews, what the Jews do has meaning for the world. It's a mirror for the world's own fate. For this reason, the past as well as the present has become a battleground. For central to the assault on Israel's legitimacy is an attempt to deny and rewrite history. And I want to point at least briefly to three areas. Number one, the Holocaust. Number two, archaeology. And number three, if I don't run out of time, genetics. And what renders these discourses so insidious is the fact that both exist in what I would call extreme and soft versions. The former preposterous, the second occupying this boundary area around plausibility between legitimacy and not. The other thing I would say is that they all really recapitulate supersessionism, the replacement theory of the early church. As you all know, the church claimed that because the Jews were blind to the teachings of their own message, because they betrayed their prophets, because they killed God, they were punished, and of course the consequence was exile from their land. I think we see a direct replication of these memes here. We can go into the discussion about the psychological, intellectual reasons, but the pattern I think is clear. Number one, the Holocaust. I've called this the new discourse of remorse. Stefan Brigat has eloquently explained the logic and function of this policy, for example, in the case of Iran, so I'm going to bracket that, but I'd like to make one point. We instinctively regard Holocaust denial as preposterous. This is as the idea, for example, that aliens built the pyramids. But even though it seems that way to us, and it is, scholars can articulate criteria for distinguishing nonsense from legitimate revision of existing ideas, and this should occupy us as well. In contrast to Holocaust denial, the soft instrumentalization of the Holocaust in anti-Israel arguments enjoys considerable popular acceptance. Number one, these canards are Israel's right to exist derives from the Holocaust. Number two, Europe created Israel based on emotions of guilt rather than reason and fairness. We heard about this yesterday. This is historically not accurate, of course. Palestinians thus paid the price for the crimes of Europeans. And number four, Israel has failed to learn lessons, in quotes, of the Holocaust and has itself become an oppressor. So five, in the most extreme version, of course, the Israelis become Nazis. 1 and 2. It's not that the great powers created a Jewish state out of Holocaust guilt. Aryeh Kochavi showed this yesterday, played no role whatsoever. But that the Jews sought it because Holocaust. It could be an innocent mistake. We saw President Obama do this in his Cairo speech, for example. And to some extent, of course, it's a law of unintended consequences. The Zionists were so successful in using the Holocaust after the war to generate popular support, if not actual diplomatic action. And of course, it's become a trope in the meantime, the idea of Israel as a bulwark against a future Holocaust. Still, once we've accepted 1 and 2, number 3 necessarily follows as an otherwise inexplicable corollary. Number 4 and 5 complete the logical chain. We could subdivide these into the hard and soft versions. I was pleased to see, for example, that David Sandmill and Giovanni Quer anticipated my argument here yesterday. In this latter version, the Jews were blind to the message of their own scripture. The anti-Zionist version appropriates both the Haggadah, you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Gospels. Again, Jewish blindness to their own message. In this case, though, the message is the history of Jewish suffering and the new religion of human rights. So Israelis become the new Nazis. We can all cite a panoply of examples from cartoons, an Israeli military boat with a flag showing skulls and barbed wire attacking the Mavi Marmara, the Mavi Marmara being attacked by an octopus with a swastika in its head, the children in the Warsaw Ghetto being the same as the children in Gaza, or take your pick, and so on and so forth. Certainly nothing historically is like, in quotes, what the Nazis did. What could be more wounding than to take a nation's most severe trauma and deprive them of that and say, this is not yours, this is ours. Not just to universalize it, but to expropriate it. Further, since it's difficult, if not impossible, to imagine a rigorous and focused rather than emotional and sweeping use of the analogy, it almost always fits the EUMC definition of anti-Semitism. The key words, again, being depending on context. I won't go into details about the philosophy and logic and analogy, but the point of analogy, of course, is that there has to be a strict comparison. There have to be connections. And since there isn't one here, the Nazi analogy serves an emotional and tactical rather than analytical purpose. By painting the Israelis as the new Nazis, the radical anti-Zionist movement annuls Jewish suffering and anoints the Palestinians as the double victims of both the Holocaust and Israel, with a doubly pedigreed and sole claim to moral sympathy and eventually the land. Previously, the Nazis were absolute evil. The Jews were therefore the absolute victims, absolute innocents. So today, if Israel is the Nazis, Israel is absolute evil, and its victims are absolute and pure victims. And of course, we know there's only one way to deal with Nazis. You can figure out the implications. If the instrumentalization of the Holocaust undermines Jewish indigeneity in history, the next two do so very explicitly. Archaeology. The hard version is largely confined to the Islamist camp and the Western lunatic fringe. If you look at reports on, periodically on Palestinian media, that is some statements from the Palestinian Authority and some from preachers and so forth, you will see repeatedly the claim there was never a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. This was, of course, a stumbling point also, as Dennis Ross observed in the Camp David talks. Again, if there's an unwillingness to accept verifiable historical fact about the past, this makes negotiating about the present all the more difficult. It became a popular trope as well. Again, here's where the critics will play on public openness to the possibility of doubt. It could be otherwise. we should not reject this out of hand. So, for example, to be sure, for a variety of reasons, we have no archaeological digs that prove the existence of the temple. But the fact that this is so does not mean the temple does not exist. But we saw this very recently in the New York Times when, some of you saw this probably, when in the wake of these kind of assertions, the Times used very carefully neutral language to talk about the existence of the temple. We have as much evidence for the existence of the temple as we do for many other things in history. This is not in doubt. But again, this opens the door to all sorts of other questions. The soft version takes a more academic form, corresponding to the evolution of scholarship, but still the parallel is striking. Biblical archaeology evolved in the West in part largely as a means of proving the truth of the Christian Bible. Obviously, archaeology has social purposes, and in the state, in the mandate in Palestine and the new state of Israel, it should not be surprising that archaeology served social purposes too, of nation building, of developing civic consciousness. One spoke about archaeology as being the national hobby, the national pastime of Israelis, hiking archaeology contests, conferences, and so forth. But the fact that this is so does not mean the profession was hopelessly tainted or more regressive than it was anywhere else. In fact, although it was not obviously operating at modern standards, it was operating within the standards of its day. But this becomes an open door for revisionists. So number one, we have, for example, the so-called biblical minimalists who argue basically that and these are people who argue based on text rather than archaeology, that the Bible was written very late in the Persian or Hellenistic era. It's a self-referential, fictitious work devoid of historical value. This is debatable. Discoveries such as the Tel Dan stele about the House of David should have put the nail in that coffin. But this also became politicized, so it wasn't just a matter of saying there was no huge Israelite empire under Solomon and so forth, but instead that Israeli archaeology was a conscious attempt to rewrite the history by erasing Palestinians and substituting the Jews on the land and in history. For example, Keith Whitlam's title, The Invention of Ancient Israel, The Silencing of Palestinian History, 1996, gives you a sense of what that was about. More recently, Nadia Abul-Hajj wrote a book about 10, 15 years ago in which she laid out the whole point of this argument. She was an anthropologist, not an field archaeologist. She wasn't particularly well versed in this, as archaeologists said, but of course, as Carrie Nelson pointed out yesterday, this is the kind of thing that humanists and people in the soft soul of social sciences eat up. It makes sense to them. And so for her, this became for her the textbook example of the settler colonial ideology. What's interesting too is not just that this is an attack against the archaeological profession, but it feeds into BDS. So we have a kind of circular system in which attacks on the scholarship feed a political narrative and then go back and legitimize the scholars boycotting and avoiding their Israeli colleagues. How am I doing in time here?
6 minutes.
Good, okay, thank you. I realize I'm zipping through various things here as I tried to make my cuts. The other point I wanted to make here was about genetics, which may seem strange. You know, the standard narrative, of course, again here, if we take in each case the standard narrative and the critique, the standard narrative is that the Jews came from the Middle East and they went to Europe, the Ashkenazim I'm talking about only, and they went to Europe. And then, of course, they moved first to Rome and to the Rhineland, and they moved westward. They moved from west to east in the 16th century, thereabouts, when the population balance shifts from the Sephardic to Ashkenazim. This is all well known, the so-called Rhineland hypothesis. But it's always been mysterious. How did there get to be so many Ashkenazi Jews? How did this change so quickly? And for a number of people on what might be called the lunatic fringe, the idea was, of course, the so-called Khazar hypothesis, that the Jews were not, that the large influx of Jewish population came from the conversion of the Khazars, a Turkic people living in southern Russia, Ukraine, from Central Asia, and that their conversion to Judaism in the 9th century then furnished the stock for the Ashkenazi population. This goes back to the 19th century. Jews worried about this question, non-Jews worried about it. The most popular version, of course, that you probably know is Arthur Koestler's book of 1976 called The 13th Tribe. And I won't go into the details of how he tries to make the argument linguistically, anthropologically, and biologically, but for our purposes, he brought this idea into the public view for the first time in a way never before. And number two, Koestler, who was a smart guy but made some mistakes, was sure this was going to end anti-Semitism. In other words, if anti-Semitism was based on the fact that Jews were a racial group or biological descended from those in the Middle East accused of deicide, if the Jews were biologically from Central Asia or Turkey or what you call it, then there can't be anti-Semitism. Of course, the reverse was true. People latched onto this and they said, therefore the Jews have no claim to the land of Israel because their descendants, these are not the descendants of the biblical Israelites. This is a view that I'm working on separately and I can't give you all the details. It flourished in British Israelite movements and extreme far-right racist movements in America, the West Coast, British Columbia, and California in the 1940s. What's interesting is that their ideas were intimately wrapped up then with being opposed to Jewish statehood in Palestine and being opposed to communism. So it's anti-Zionist, anti-Bolshevik. It's a typical hardline Cold War ideology. It featured a little bit, for example, in the UN partition debates. If you look at the statements of the Arab representatives, they will say, when we're still talking, should there be a Jewish state and an Arab state or a partition, they would say the Jews are not Israelites, they're Khazars. This goes dormant for most of the subsequent decades. It appears here and there in the 1950s and 60s, once in a while in the 70s, but then it pops up again in the 1990s and 2000s, and for a couple of reasons. Kessler was working on fairly primitive, or at the time normal, but primitive ideas about race, blood types, head shapes, and that sort of thing. With the rise of genetic science, we've been able to do a much more precise study of populations, and one of the anomalies was that we can trace, for example, descendants of the priests, the Kohanim from the Bible, through genetic markers. They're the same for Ashkenazim and for Levites, for Ashkenazim and Sephardim. In the case of the Levites, though, there's a discrepancy. The genetic markers for Ashkenazi Levites differ from those from the Sephardim, and the markers seem to be something that could be Asian or Slavic. And so there was the notion that here was a smoking gun for the Khazars. Anyway, this became then ammunition for all sorts of people. Fast forward to the 2000s, Shlomo Sand incorporated this into his book, The Invention of the Jewish People. He got the genetic evidence entirely wrong, I will say. He didn't know what he was doing, but it's not unusual. Anyway, in Sand's book, as most of you know, seeking to expose what he called the realms of silence, he argued that Judaism was fundamentally shaped by waves of conversions. The Berbers, the Khazars, and so forth. The Khazars feature prominently. The point being, of course, the Jews never saw themselves as a people. They were always a religious group, and only in the 19th century did they try to constitute themselves as a people, which was an action of the Zionist movement, and it was artificial and invented. All nations are invented. This should not have been news. This is one of those books about which wants to say what's new in it is not good, and what's good in it is not new. But the book is very popular. He wrote first in French. It got wide circulation in the Arab press. I was following the reviews. This was eaten up by people because, again, it becomes ammunition in the anti-Zionist argument. And then Sand, of course, himself becomes an anti-Zionist, though he lives in Israel, and obviously he's not an anti-Semite. But this book is then picked up. And so you have a conglomeration of arguments here that deny Jewish indigeneity. The archaeological argument, the genetic argument. The other argument where they come together, and I won't go into the details, is that, in some sense we think that Jews were descended from Canaanites. It's a complex argument. But in the hands of the anti-Zionists, then, the Jews are interlopers. They are not indigenous. The only true indigenous people are the Palestinians. In fact, under this argument, the Palestinians are descended from the original Israelites, so they're more Jewish than the Jews. And these arguments then come together to make the case that there is no historical connection between the Jews and the land of Israel, and therefore that statehood is not justified.
Jim, 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going fast. I think too fast, but we'll catch up. So I think in all of these cases, then we have a picture that emerges in which the Jews are deprived of their own landscape, their own history, and in the sense of a narrative past, and their sense of identity. What's interesting about this, too, is you put them all together, they really do recapitulate the replacement theory in lots of ways, and we just see the same kind of dichotomies, as we saw yesterday in some of these discussions, too, for example, with BDS and the Presbyterian Church. We have the dichotomy of love versus law, the letter of the law versus the spirit of law, power and oppression versus innocence. And above all, I think here, then universalism versus particularism. The irony, of course, is two ironies, actually, two for the price of one. The irony, of course, is number one, no one admits to being anti-Semite, and yet everyone is a Jew. So Jesus becomes a Palestinian. Who's the true Jew? Yasser Arafat said that in Beirut that this was the Warsaw Ghetto. Gaza becomes the Warsaw Ghetto. You can go on and on and on. The strongest arguments used against the Jewish state and Jewish peoplehood are appropriated from the Jewish past. I think these trends are disturbing for a couple of reasons. First of all, politics aside, to be able to distinguish between legitimate historical revision and historical denial is of crucial intellectual as well as moral importance. And the debate over Jewish indigeneity can serve as a textbook example of the use and abuse of history. Second, to return to politics, to open a new contest over origins and rights, to attempt to relitigate the context is pure regression. This is the kind of thing we expected before 1947 when partition being debated. Perhaps the 1960s and 70s, we have the case for Israel on the one hand, the question of Palestine on the rest. But to go back to whose land this is again, a pure form of regression. The issue should be dividing the land, learning to live, learning to find a way to coexist. And so this is very disturbing. To the extent it also becomes theologized through Islam, through the exclusive claims to the holy places, denial of the temple, and so forth, the conflict becomes all the more intractable. It gets re-internationalized.
Jim, I'm afraid you must wrap up.
I have my one last phrase, so I'll stop there, and I will just say that achieving peace in the present is hard enough without distorting the past. Thank you.